Hello, everybody. It must be Wednesday because you are accessing this lecture. We're going to talk about counter-revolutions and social changes that are happening in this new Europe between 1815 and 1914. Before we go too much further, let's talk about some terms. First, balance of powers. It's a geopolitical diplomatic effort to keep each European country equally powerful to its rivals, thus ensuring peace. Technology should be used to modernize the military in order to ensure the best possible defense. Diplomacy should also be used to ensure rivals are kept off balance. This usually occurs through a series of shifting alliances, sometimes public, sometimes not. Nationalism is a political indoctrination which puts the nation's interest above everything else. It replaces local, regional, ethnic, religious, or other loyalties with a loyalty to an abstract concept, and that is the nation. It is used often to motivate, inspire, and to reorganize a country en masse. Détente. This is a term that actually comes from the early 20th century, but it can be applied to the 19th century. And essentially, it is a French term meaning this kind of easing of tensions through diplomatic, economic, and other relations. It's not necessarily friendly, but it's also not openly hostile either. Now, in 1815, the coalition of nations that had come together to defeat Napoleon finally succeed and depose him for the last time after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Now, this cooperation dissolves into this kind of uneasy détente. See, we would use it right away. The political negotiations basically redraw the European map. So it reconfigures the nation state, and it does so in a way that doesn't really account for ethnic, religious, linguistic, or even cultural differences between peoples. Now, you may think, well, a nation's a nation, they're all going to have the same language, they're all going to have the same touchstones. That's not true in the early 19th century. There are still lots of variations and lots of divisions that still exist. National policies are then intended to educate the populace about nationalism. So once you've expanded those borders and taken control and consolidated control over certain areas, you want everybody to be basically on the same page. And that's where nationalism comes in. Now, Napoleon was an existential threat to many nations. In fact, he conquered Portugal, the Netherlands, Spain, parts of Germany, Prussia. He conquered all of these nations that had existed for quite some time before. Now, after his conquest, he became this kind of boogeyman for the rest of Europe. Places like Sweden, for Russia, for England, for example. And part and parcel of his conquest came this notion that he was going to expand revolutionary ideas and that he would be essentially an inspiration to the lower classes to overthrow the existing monarchies in favor of a more revolutionary society that might allow for either the invasion of Napoleon or the rise of a Napoleon-like figure within their society. This is particularly true in England. There was a lot of fear of workers' movements kind of morphing into this broader, like French Revolution-esque uh, upending of society. So this united conquered Europe was also a threat because it meant a loss of sovereignty for those in power. Much like when two businesses merge, you don't need two CFOs, you don't need two COOs, you don't need two managers, so somebody has to go. And so this is also another form of a loss of sovereignty. And then finally, uniform laws and language. The Napoleonic Empire was spreading the Napoleonic Code, which actually still informs much of European law, much of mainland European law, which again was another kind of existential threat and this loss of culture to Russia, Sweden, to Greece, to the English as well. So once France is defeated, you have this existential threat that suddenly just disappears. It's kind of like imagine that you're walking down a set of steps in the dark and then you hit the bottom. Well, you have that jarring sensation. Well, you're still expecting to go deeper down. And that's essentially what happens to a lot of these European nations. So what is needed is a sense of national identity or nationalism. And nationalism is used as a method of kind of continuing the fervor to protect the nation state, to protect the sovereignty of a people. And it's also used as a kind of form of education. Now, war against Napoleon was essentially just making sure that your society was protected. That's how it was cast, and especially in England. Nationalism is to see the inherent value in keeping this nation state and not reverting back to those regional identities and those regional loyalties. So the key to nationalism, however, is defining us. What is us? What makes a nation? Who are we? What do we stand for? What makes us unique? What makes us different from those other nations? Now, there are healthy ways to approach nationalism. Healthy ways include inspiring camaraderie amongst people who have never met. This concept of being an American or a Canadian or Brazilian or Japanese or whatever is very unique to the late modern period, and that is integral part of a person's identity. Think about it this way. When you go to study abroad, if you go to another country and you're studying alone and you're in a market or you're in a store or you're in a social situation and you find another American, it doesn't matter if they're from Texas or Illinois or Alaska or Florida or whatever, you just automatically feel there's a certain connection like, oh yeah, I'm an American too. Where are you from? I'm from Kentucky. Oh wow, I've never been to Kentucky. I've always lived my entire life in Arizona. What's it like? And you have that kind of common bond, and that is a healthy form of nationalism. You get to identify with people that you otherwise would never have met. It also inspires loyalty to abstract ideas. It's a very hard to pin down what exactly does justice mean? What does freedom mean? What does equality mean? What does the nation mean? And so you have this abstract idea of what your nation is. Each nation likes to think themselves freer than other nations. And that's absolutely true. And that is a side effect of more of a healthy, slightly less healthy nation. It also inspires self-sacrifice, this idea of risking for others in your nation. It is part of the reason why some people volunteer to go into the military. It's part of the reason why some people volunteer to be community organizers. It's part of the reason why some people volunteer to work for Habitat for Humanity or 100 other reasons. It is this inspiring of self-sacrifice to better one's nation, better one's society. Now, on the flip side of healthy nationalisms, there's also unhealthy nationalisms, and unfortunately, it's really hard to pull those apart. Sometimes unhealthy nationalisms can be used to alienate or dehumanize non-nationals. It can be used, for example, in instances of racism, especially when we get to colonialism, when we start talking about expanding the colonial empire. It also can be used for forms of discrimination, even internally. Anti-Semitism is a good example of that. Jim Crow laws. It's a good way to find enemies within the state. You can say, oh, they're the X is the enemy of the people, or are looking to undermine us, or Z are all terrorists, that sort of thing. And then that kind of nationalism can be used to justify pretty much anything. It can be used to justify cruelty, bigotry, ignorance, uncritical acceptance of whatever a leader is saying. And that is true in the 19th century, and unfortunately in the 20th century, and even more unfortunately in the 21st century. So I've got some questions for you, though. Are you indoctrinated by nationalism? Well, okay, finish this statement. I pledge allegiance. You probably immediately in your brain, even if you didn't say it, heard the rest of that line. How about finish this statement? Land of the free, home of the brave, right? Why? Are you born knowing that? How about finishing this statement? Thank you for your... You learned those. You weren't innately born knowing English and innately born loving America. Nobody is. I don't care how dipped in red, white, and blue they think they are. Nobody was born straight out of the womb loving America. Nobody was. So where does it come from? Well, it comes from indoctrination or for lack of a better term, education. There are multiple subtle and not so subtle influences that form a concept of nationalism. Thomas Jefferson recognized this and he saw the need to educate people about Republican values and Republican virtues. And this is Republican non-party. This is just the essence of being a participant in a representative republic. This idea of Republican virtues. And so he wanted to evoke the Roman Republic without actually teaching the history, because that gets a little complex and that's a little kind of tangled mess. So what happens in money, for example, our money is rife with patriotic symbolism, things like eagles, which represent, what do they represent? What about an olive branch? What does olive branch represent? What about the arrows clutched in the other claw? What do those represent? And why are there 13 of them? Who is on the front of the $1 bill? Why are they on front of the $1 bill? It's also happening in architecture. On the top here, we have the Supreme Court building. On the bottom, we have the Pantheon in Rome. They're almost separated at birth, aren't they? They look nearly identical. It also happens in art. On the left, we have a portrait or a carving statue of George Washington. In his hand, he has a bundle of sticks that are actually covering a cannon, which represents a weapon. Behind him, he has a plow, and he is leaning on a stick. To the right, we have a picture taken from here in Cincinnati, up at Alt Park. Is it Alt Park? Pretty sure Alt Park. Where it shows Cincinnatus, the Roman general who led Rome in defense of the Republic, and then, when all was said and done, he gave up power and handed back the symbol of his authority, which was an axe wrapped in a bundle of sticks. So it's a weapon wrapped in a bundle of sticks. And he's leaning upon a plow. So why do they depict George Washington as a modern day Cincinnatus? It even happens when we talk about pledging allegiance in school. We're taught from a very early age to pledge allegiance to the flag. By the way, you'll notice that maybe things have changed over the intervening years. This is a picture taken from the 1930s in the United States. And yes, the children are actually holding their hand out as if they are offering something to the flag. It's a little too close to another type of hand gesture towards a certain type of flag that will come into play in World War II. So that was kind of scrapped after World War II. And children said Pledge of Allegiance differently. Nationalism inspires service to country beyond just mere social advancement. Although social advancement does still play a role, particularly in officers, it doesn't necessarily play a role for enlisted. The idea is to defend a national way of life, whatever that may be. And the result is an army that is paid and well equipped. Maybe not well paid, but at least well equipped. Nationalism provides a reason for existing, a raison d'etre, for a paid army and a navy. Now, much like our founding fathers might have warned us, standing armies do kind of become a hammer for a nation. And then if you all you have is a hammer, then every problem begins to look like a nail. So the existence of these nations, especially these well-paid professional armies, is used to uh, its existence justifies its use. It is used in a variety of ways, as we will see as we move on, some of which we may not be very comfortable with. It also is used to distract from domestic issues, national issues. So nationalism in professional armies can be a bad side of nationalism, but not necessarily. From We transitioned very quickly from this nationalist idea into colonialism. Within about a generation and a half, Europeans begin making inroads in places like Africa and in Asia. Europeans extending their reach into Africa and Asia is not a new thing, but it becomes accelerated in the 19th century, particularly after the 1880s when the Germans hold the Berlin Conference, in which a kind of ground rules are set up for dividing up Africa and what is necessary to be considered holding a territory as a colony. And this is to prevent a war from breaking out in Europe, at least between European powers. And it's also to ensure that there's an orderly and functional way to extract resources. Those rules are still in play in Africa today. Most rails in Europe, in England, North America, they all go to various different cities. They go all over. They crisscross. Most rails that are left over from colonial exploitation in Africa, they go from places where elements were extracted, whether it be raw materials, rubber, whatever, to the port cities. So just basically one way. They don't go crisscross. It's much like going uptown, downtown, but not across town. Military is often used to beat back local resistance. The Boer War is a good example of this. You can look that up. It'll be in the resources as well. And the Belgian in the Congo. Rivalry, however, happens abroad. So you have this competition between the French, the English, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Germans even get involved in it, and the effect of a war for colonial domination is basically avoided. That side effect of the war spilling over into Europe and possibly plunging Europe into a devastating war. In fact, um, Otto von Bismarck, who had called the Berlin Conference, said that he is certain that if war were to come to Europe, it would probably be some damn fool adventure that would happen in the Balkans. He was worried about colonization spreading in Southeast Europe. So, shows how prophetic he might indeed be. So, how does nationalism play out in colonial acquisition of territory? Well, let's look at India. Now, first, the event that I'm going to look at is an event that happened in 1857 that goes by several different names. Now, if you read British accounts, it's called the Sepoy Mutiny. And a mutiny seems to implicate that these were soldiers or sailors who had a duty, who threw off their duty and ignored their superiors and rebelled anyway. In India, it's referred to as the First War of Independence. And that really tells you something. Um, Short background, essentially most of India was governed indirectly by the British East India Company. And the British East India Company was hiring local soldiers to be basically their mercenary army. Due to a series of very bad judgments on the part of the British East India Company, not least of which was to insult the Muslim and Hindu majority that were making up their army. There was uh, a taking of the barracks and basically a kind of riot that spilled into a kind of revolution. These mercenary army basically turned against their employers. In a bid to salvage the very lucrative business that is the British East India Company, the British government gets involved and sends military troops abroad to India to put down this insurrection. And they indeed do put down that insurrection. And this leads to a more direct rule by the British Crown in India. It also sets up monopolies on critical industries within India, such as the making of cloth, the growing of tea, the manufacture of salt, all of which are absolutely necessary in the 19th century, because you can't go around naked with spoiled food and nothing to drink, right? So this leads to a consolidation of colonial power in India. So, but also, why was India so important to Britain? Well, because it had a role to play with this next nationalist and colonialist adventure, and that is against China. British merchants had learned in the early 1800s that mixing tobacco with opium, a distillate of opium poppy seeds, would lead to a highly addictive substance that could be smoked. It is a painkiller, but it also promotes this profound sense of lethargy, this profound uh, happiness, this kind of sleepiness and driftiness. But it's also highly addictive. For that reason, it was made illegal in China. It was also made illegal in Britain. However, it was not illegal to grow in India, and it was not illegal to transport under British law. So China, of course, sends a direct plea to the British Crown saying, tell your merchants to stop smuggling opium into our borders, or we will get very angry. And in 1839, after that plea to the government was ignored, the Chinese government fulfilled its promise, and the Qing dynasty seized 1,200 metric tons of opium. To give you an idea of how much opium was being imported, 1 metric ton is about 2,206 pounds or 1,000 kilos. So it's 1.2 billion kilos of opium were being imported in a single year. That's a lot of opium. You think we have an opioid crisis now? Imagine if Mexico were sending 1.2 billion kilos every year of opium. We'd get upset, and so did the Chinese. Well, the British merchants were very upset that their precious cargo had been seized. This was the one time in history of dealing with China that there was a product that the English could sell to the Chinese and get money back rather than just use it as trade for tea or porcelain or silk or dyes or food or whatever. Well, the British merchants persuade Parliament to wage war over what they termed illegally seized property. And the upshot is that China does lose and must pay for the opium that was seized and must open 5 more ports to the English. Well, over the intervening 20 years, well, not quite 20 years, it's about 17 years, China had gone through several reforms and they again made opium illegal and again seized the stockpile of opium from English traders. England again wages war against China, and China again loses the war. Uh, this war turns out to be extremely disastrous for the Chinese because the British are granted what's called extraterritorial rights. In other words, they are immune to Chinese laws. The Chinese must pay for the war and pay reparations for the war, and they must make opium legal again, and they must offer a certain percentage of their population to become what are known as coolies. You might say, that sounds a lot like slavery, but the British would say, no, it's not slavery, it's merely indentured servitude. Yeah, I'll let that hang there. But nationalism was also used, the standing armies were also used at home. The standing armies were used as adjuncts for domestic police, particularly in quelling riots and demonstrations. A great example of this is Ireland, where the military was used as kind of like a strike force against Irish unrest. It was also used to punish agitators. So socialist or communist or anarchist gatherings could often be quelled at the end of a bayonet or with a bullet. But it wasn't just England, too. So I don't want to paint just England as the bad guys. There's a lot of bad going around because of these nationalist standing armies and this kind of feeling of enemies within the borders or without the borders. A good example of this is the Trail of Tears. Between 1838 and 1839, initially 5, but then expanding up to 7 different what were known as civilized nations. In other words, nations within the United States, Native American tribes, that had begun assimilating into American society, learning English, dressing in Western style clothing, adopting agrarian policies, entrepreneurship, that sort of thing. Well, their land was seized in the 1830s thanks to the Indian Removal Act of 1837. Uh, and they were relocated forcibly in the middle of winter toward to Oklahoma, where thousands died along what is now known as the Trail of Tears. Why was their land in places like Florida, Georgia, and Alabama seized? Because gold was found there. And gold was seen as a resource that was best utilized by white people. And before you think I'm just overstating the simplicity of it, you can look up Worcester versus Georgia, which is these evangelical Christians had settled on Cherokee land and claimed the Cherokee land as their own in order to protect the territorial claims of the Cherokees from Georgia because there was this concept called eminent domain. The government can't take away that land without paying you a fair price. And if there's gold on it, they must pay you a lot. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court because Georgia said, well, these evangelical Christians are settling in territory without proper license. Uh, the Christians argued that, well, since it wasn't Georgian territory and it was Cherokee territory, which is a sovereign nation, they were invited in, they purchased land, and therefore they are living on that land legally purchased from the existing government within Georgia. The case actually almost pit the Supreme Court against the executive branch because the executive branch, led by Andrew Jackson, who's on the $20 bill, by the way, Andrew Jackson wanted to confiscate this land, wanted to get this land, and had ignored the rulings, or was seemed to be signaling that they were going to ignore the rulings of the Supreme Court. Eventually, however, the state of Georgia dropped all charges, so the case went away. So then the Indian Removal Act could take place because there was no case now. There was no adjudication. And so that land could be seized, and the white evangelical Christians were given a nominal payment for the small parcel of land that they were recognized as having owned. The Supreme Court even upholds time and time again within the 19th century that Congress has the unilateral right to breach treaties with Native Americans. This is outlined in a Supreme Court case called Hitchcock v. Lone Wolf in 1903. And also, again, because we're going to spread the love, we're going to talk about how nationalism and the finding enemies within can become toxic. There's an affair that happens in France, the so-called Dreyfus Affair. In 1896, a captain in the French army, Alfred Dreyfus, is accused by a rival, who happens to be a Christian, of selling secrets to the Germans. It turns out not to be true. Many, many years later, about 10 or 11 years later, he is acquitted and eventually exonerated. Turns out he was falsely accused. However, during his first trial, which he was sentenced to life at hard labor, a lot of the trial was punctuated with anti-Semitic remarks and anti-Semitic beliefs that somehow the Jews who had come to France in the early 1800s could not be considered true French citizens because they held loyalty to this kind of supranational identity of being a Jew, that they were inherently untrustworthy. His second trial was also rife with anti-Semitic attacks, and he was publicly humiliated twice. The second time he was only sentenced to 10 years. That sentence was commuted in 1906. He was restored to his rank of captain, and he served honorably in World War I, dying in the mid-1930s. But within all of that, within that story, there is the toxicity of some nationalism, that there is a desire, a need, a kind of excuse to find an other within. Somebody within is holding us back. Somebody within is making us weak. Somebody within is seeking to divide us, and we must root them out, regardless of whether there's any truth to that accusation or not. And so these imaginary enemies that crop up in the nationalist rhetoric do crop up again and again and again and again, unfortunately. The upshot, however, of this nationalism and this establishment of what's known as the European balance of powers is that Europe avoids any major wars until 1914. It is often referred to by historians as kind of the long 19th century, and that's because these attitudes survived well into the 20th century. The attitudes of culture, of society, of that things will keep being this way well into the 20th century, or that if a war were to break out, it's not going to be a major war, it's going to be a minor war, it's going to be over really quickly. We don't have to worry about it. There will be no major like Napoleonic war in Europe. New players such as Germany and Italy do cause a rethinking of the balance of power, but don't necessarily upend it completely. And in many cases, in the case of the Berlin Conference that I mentioned that happened in 1882, they try to become equal partners. Italy itself enters into a series of interlocking alliances, becomes kind of a colonial player, even tries to invade Ethiopia along with the rest of the Europeans, establishing a colony in Africa to be considered one of the major players. So, in conclusion, nationalism and nation states, as they emerge in the 19th century, they do allow for a deeper unification of a people, and they allow for the absorption of new peoples into the body politic, so that you don't have these kind of necessarily or automatically xenophobic mistrusts of people. And it allows for the assimilation and dissemination of ideas and notions from around the world. This concept of perhaps being an advocate for the poor, or of resisting injustice, or of standing up for your rights. The Dreyfus Affair was not just a French affair, it was an international affair. There were people in the United States, in France, I'm sorry, not just in France, in the United States, that were in England, and that were in Russia, that were following the story in the newspapers, and so it became part of like an international zeitgeist. But nationalism also does allow for treating others as non-human because they don't fit into a neat category of being a true whatever nationality you are. You're not a real American until you fill in blank. You're not a real Brit unless you fill in blank. It also allows for unthinking, unquestioning patriotism. And unquestioning patriotism is a fanaticism, and that's a problem. You have to look at each situation and say, am I being manipulated? Are we doing the right thing for the right reasons? It also allows for the alienation of internal enemies, whether through Jim Crow laws and segregation, whether through anti-Semitic and anti-minority or anti-Catholic sentiment, or anti-religious sentiment, or anti-a-religious sentiment. So that pretty much concludes our lecture. It was relatively quick, only about half an hour. I didn't have to stop and ask questions, as you see. Do make sure that you finish off the work for this week. And don't forget that next week we will not have class, but I will record both lectures. They will be independent, and you guys will have to access those as well. You guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks.